woman fought the January wind with both hands, dragging a sheet of heavy canvas across the mouth of the hillside, while her young son struggled to hold the rope behind her. Snow blasted sideways into their faces. Something inside the dark shelter kicked hard against the wall. Then the rope slipped. She lunged for it before the canvas could tear free. The wind caught the cloth like a sail, nearly pulling her off her feet. Behind her, the boy shouted as another burst of snow poured toward the entrance. Across the frozen valley, lanterns were moving between barns. Men were already outside with shovels. Animals were crying behind wooden walls as powder forced its way through every seam. But the woman did not look toward them. She stared at the strange opening she had carved into the earth. Months earlier, tightened the rope around her freezing hands and pulled. The canvas snapped violently, and somewhere inside the hill, something cracked. Josephine Ainsworth was 18 years old, the morning she rode out of Halverson's Bend with $11 folded into the lining of her coat and a brass compass pressed against her ribs, and the sway-backed mule under her carried the whole of what the world had left her, which was less than most men carried in a saddlebag. The sky over the stage road ran the color of skimmed milk, and the air had that thin autumn bite the high desert takes on when October turns its shoulder toward November, and the dust of the yard she had swept for 7 years lifted around the mule's hooves in small pale ghosts that settled again behind her without any sound at all. She did not look back. She had already done her looking in the tack room in the dark, folded against a saddle blanket that smelled of the animal she was about to sell for the price of a week's rent in any decent town. And she had spent enough of her strength on that building to know a person could not carry a house in their coat pocket, no matter how many years they had greased its hinges. Nobody watching from the porch of Halverson's Bend that morning knew what she was riding toward. Not the man in shirt sleeves who stood at the rail, with a mug of her uncle's coffee cooling in his soft hand. Not the two hostlers who had come out of the barn to watch her go and had lifted their hats a half inch and let them drop again. Not the woman across the road who had run the stage kitchen for 16 years and had once given Josephine a slice of dried apple pie on a plate the girl had never seen used for company. None of them knew that somewhere west of the salt flats, in a dry wash the maps called Pinnacle and the freighters called nothing at all, because no freighter had come back from it in 6 weeks, a convoy of 6 Studebaker wagons lay tipped and torn open under the sun with its teams gone and its drivers stiff in the shade of their own canvas. None of them knew that half the territorial marshals between Prescott and Yuma had been asking after those wagons since the 1st of September. None of them knew that the girl on the swayback mule, riding west because west was the one direction her uncle had ever spoken of without a curse in it, was the person the wash had been waiting for. Settle in and stay close. And before we go any further, let us know down in the comments where you're watching from tonight. The town where Josephine had been born was called Thistlewood Crossing, and it sat on the north edge of a played-out silver district in the Arizona Territory, and by the year of her birth, it had already begun the slow business of forgetting what it had once been. Her father was a freighter named Nathaniel Ainsworth, who ran ore wagons between the stamp mill and the rail siding at Winslow, and her mother was a school teacher named Ruth, who kept 40 children quiet in a whitewashed room behind the Methodist church and made $22 a month doing it. Nathaniel was a broad man with a voice that carried the length of a corral, and he came home smelling of axle grease and creosote and the peculiar sweet dust that clings to a man who has been riding all day beside a load of galena. He would sit Josephine on his knee at the kitchen table when she was small enough to fit inside his coat, and he would open the freight ledger on the oilcloth and let her turn the pages while he read the numbers aloud. And she learned before she learned her letters that a barrel of coarse salt weighed 200 pounds and cost $1.60 at the Mercantile in Winslow and could be sold for $2.10 at the mining camp in the hills. Her mother taught her at the same kitchen table in the evenings by the yellow light of a coal oil lamp with a chipped chimney. And she taught patiently, without ever raising her voice. And she taught Josephine to write her name in a hand that leaned slightly to the right, and to sound out the names of the plants that grew along the arroyo behind their adobe. Cholla and mesquite, and the small purple flower Ruth called owl clover, because it opened at dusk. Ruth laughed easily and often, and when Josephine asked a question, Ruth had a way of answering it that made the girl feel she had already been halfway to the answer on her own. And this was a gift Josephine did not understand the size of until she was much older and had met a great many people who did not give it. The fever came through Thistlewood Crossing in the spring of the year Josephine turned 11, and it took her mother in the space of 5 afternoons and her father in the space of 9. There was nothing dramatic in the leaving of either of them. Ruth grew hot and then cold and then quiet, and she looked at Josephine on the last morning with the same steady patience she had brought to a spelling lesson, and she said only, "Mind your uncle when he comes." Nathaniel lasted longer because he was stronger, and he spent his last days in a kind of angry confusion, calling out the names of horses that had died years before and once trying to sit up as if to answer a question nobody had asked. When it was over, Josephine stood in the yard in a dress her mother had let out twice and could not let out again, and she watched two men from the burial society roll a barrow down the wagon track toward the little cemetery on the rise. And the sound the wheels made in the pale gravel was the sound her childhood ended on. She was taken in that same week by her father's older brother Ezekiel, a wagon master who had never married and who lived alone in a plank house at a stage stop called Halverson's Bend, 40 miles south along the road that ran toward the Mogollon Rim. Ezekiel was tall and slightly bent from a life spent leaning against wagon boards, and his mustache had gone the color of old iron, and his hands had been broken in 3 places over the years and set by men who were not doctors. He did not know what to do with a grieving child. He said as much to the reverend who brought her out to him in a buggy, standing on his porch with his thumbs hooked into his belt and looking at Josephine the way a man looks at a piece of machinery he has been asked to repair with the wrong tools. But he took her inside and made her a bed in the small room off the kitchen, and he set a tin cup and a tin plate at his own table across from his, and he began the only kind of teaching he knew how to do, which was the teaching of hands. For 7 years he taught her, and she learned. She learned the ring of a good hub and the dull answer of one gone soft. She learned how to reset a fellow by the fire and how to shoe a mule that had been made mean by a careless man before her and had to be talked into standing. She learned to read the sky at 4 in the afternoon and know whether the wind would come up from the southwest or drop away entirely by dark. And she learned to read the ground for the track of a jackrabbit as different from the track of a fox, and to read the twitch of a team's ears for what the team was thinking about doing next. She learned the honest weight of a barrel by the sound it made when you rapped it with your knuckle, and she learned the dishonest tricks a bad driver used to shave a load, and she learned that Ezekiel Ainsworth considered a man who shaved a load lower than a man who stole outright, because a thief at least admitted what he was. He was not affectionate. He never once put his hand on her shoulder, and he never once told her he was proud of her. And if she had waited for either of those things, she would have waited until the day he died and gone on waiting. But he taught her, and he fed her, and he did not lie to her. And by the time she was 13, she understood that these were the ways a certain kind of man loved a child when he did not know how to say the word. The compass came into her keeping on an evening in the spring of her 15th year. They had eaten a supper of beans and salt pork and cornbread cut from the iron pan, and Ezekiel had pushed his tin plate an inch away from him the way he always did when he was finished, and he had reached into the breast pocket of his coat and taken out the small brass instrument he had carried there for as long as Josephine had known him. He set it on the oilcloth between them. The case was scratched along the edges from 4 decades of riding against a man's ribs, and the glass over the face had a chip at the 4 o'clock mark that caught the lamplight when the case was open. He pushed it across to her with 2 fingers. Rode with a scout out of Yuma in '62 who gave me that. His voice was the same flat voice he used for talking about weather. I hauled with a man named Barnaby Threlkeld on the southern route around that same time. He come out of Kentucky. Best set of eyes for a bad crossing I ever rode behind. His pale eyes lifted to hers and held there. Ain't seen him in 20 years. He might still be alive or he might not. World turns over a lot of men in 20 years. He tapped the compass once with his knuckle. You'll want to know which way is north. Time will come. She had closed her fingers around it and had felt the weight of it settle into her palm. And she had understood without any words being said that she had been given something that would not be given again. She had put the compass into the inner pocket of her own coat that same night and had worn it there for 3 years. And the name Barnaby Threlkeld had lodged itself in a corner of her memory in the way a small stone lodges in the tread of a boot and rides along unnoticed until the day the boot comes off. Ezekiel died in the first week of October in the 9th year of her life with him, in the chair by the stove with a mug of coffee gone cold in his hand. He had been coughing for a month and he had refused twice to let her ride to the town 12 miles east for the doctor, and on the 3rd morning she came in from the corral and found him with his chin down on his chest, and the coffee cooled to the temperature of the room around him. She did not cry, because Ezekiel had not raised a crier, and she did not sit and wait, because Ezekiel had not raised a waiter. She washed his face with a clean cloth. She laid him out on the plank floor of the front room on his own good blanket. She rode to the stage station and told the manager, and by evening 2 men had come out and helped her carry Ezekiel to the rise behind the plank house and dig the grave in the caliche, where the shovels rang like they were striking iron. She said over him the plain words her mother had said over a neighbor once, that the ground was patient and the wind was kind, and the rest was not for her to know. And the 2 men from the station stood with their hats in their hands and did not speak, because they had never heard a girl of 18 bury a man that way. She believed for 4 days that the plank house was hers, not because anyone had told her so, but because there had been no one else in Ezekiel's life, and because a person who has done the work of a grown hand for 7 years without a wage learns to expect that the work will be counted for something at the end. She fed the stock. She swept the porch. She kept the coffee pot on the stove because the drivers who came through the stage stop still came into the plank house for a cup and a word about the road, and it did not occur to her to turn them away. She kept the tobacco tin under the loose floorboard, where Ezekiel had always kept it, and did not open it, because opening it felt like a thing a person did after a decent interval, and 4 days was not an interval. On the fourth morning, a buggy came up the wagon track from the south, and a man got out of it in a black frock coat and polished boots in the softest hands Josephine had ever seen on a man over the age of 30. He was pale where Ezekiel had been weathered, and he wore a small round pair of spectacles that pinched the bridge of his nose, and he took them off to polish them on a linen handkerchief before he came up onto the porch. He introduced himself as Silas Merriweather of Santa Fe, and he said that he was Ezekiel Ainsworth's half-brother by their father's first marriage, and he had a paper in the breast pocket of his coat that would explain the rest. The paper was a lawyer's letter from a firm on the plaza in Santa Fe, and it said in careful clerkly language that Ezekiel Gainsworth had died without a will, and that the estate of a man who died without a will passed to the nearest blood relation, and that the nearest blood relation was Silas Merriweather, who had presented documents of birth and baptism that satisfied the court. Silas explained all of this while sitting at Josephine's kitchen table and drinking a mug of Josephine's coffee that she had poured him, because Ezekiel had raised her to pour coffee for a guest before she asked his business. He explained it slowly, the way a man explains a thing to a horse he is not sure of, and when he had finished, he folded the paper along its creases and set it flat on the oilcloth between them, and looked at her with a face that had been arranged into sympathy, the way a shop window is arranged for a holiday. The house, the land, the stock, the tin on the floor. He paused on the last item, and something moved behind the spectacles, and Josephine understood that he had been in the plank house before, perhaps more than once, and knew about the floorboard. All of it, I'm sorry. That's the law. She looked at him for a long moment across the table, and she thought of Ezekiel in the chair by the stove, and she thought of the 7 years of her hands, and she thought of what Ezekiel had told her once about a man arguing from a losing position, which was that such a man taught the winner only how much he had won. She did not argue. She asked him what he intended to do about the mule she had raised from a foal, a big jointed brown gelding with a sway to his back and a way of turning his ear to her voice, and Silas took a leather purse from his coat and counted 11 silver dollars onto the oilcloth in a small tidy stack one at a time, and said that this was more than fair and that she was welcome to a week to gather her things. She thanked him for the coffee, which was hers. She took the $11 off the table one at a time and put them into the pouch at her belt. She went out to the corral in the last of the afternoon light and stood a long while with her hand on the mule's neck and did not weep, because there was nothing to be gained by weeping, but she did press her forehead against his warm hide for the space of one long breath and let it go. In the week she was given, she gathered less than a person might have thought. She folded her second dress and her one good linen shirt into a flour sack. She rolled the wool blanket from her cot and tied it with a length of harness twine. She took the tin cup and the tin plate and the horn-handled knife she had used every day of her life at Halverson's Bend, and she took the small whetstone Ezekiel had kept by the stove, and she took the farrier's rasp with the worn wooden grip and the hoof pick and the coil of picket rope from the tack room, because these were her tools, and Silas did not know what half of them were for. She stood over the loose board with her boot on it one evening and thought for a long minute about the tobacco tin underneath, and then she took her boot off the board and walked away, because the paper she had signed said the tin was not hers, and she was not a thief. And a person who begins by stealing a small thing from a man she despises soon finds she has taught herself to steal. Silas moved his valise into the room that had been hers on the third day, and after that she slept in the tack room on a folded saddle blanket beneath the smell of leather and axle grease. On the fifth day she traded a spare bridle at the stage station for a canvas water bag and a week's worth of hardtack in a cotton sack. On the sixth day she asked the manager at the station where a person might go if she was headed west out of the country, and he thought about it for a while and rubbed the back of his neck. Requit Springs, maybe. Little town up past the salt pan, 130 miles or thereabouts. A say office. Livery, not much else. But it's a place. He paused and looked at her. Ain't much of a country between here and there, though. You want to think on that. She had thought on it. She had thought on it for 6 days, and she had not been able to come up with any other name. On the morning of the 7th day, she was up in the gray dark of the yard before the rooster in the coop had shaken himself. She saddled the sway-backed mule with the sun still an hour off, and she cinched the flour sack and the blanket roll behind the cantle, and she tied the canvas water bag to the near side of the saddle where she could reach it without dismounting. She checked the $11 in the pouch at her belt, and then took them out and pushed them one at a time down through the torn stitching, in the lining of her coat where they lay flat against her ribs on the same side as the compass, because a pouch could be cut and a coat lining had to be found. Silas came out onto the porch in his shirt sleeves as she was leading the mule through the gate. His braces hung loose at his hips and his hair had not been combed. He watched her for a moment with the empty morning light on his spectacles, and then he called her name across the yard, and she stopped and turned. "You've a place to go?" His voice carried the small, false warmth of a man who wants his conscience settled before breakfast. "Requa Springs." He nodded slowly as if the name confirmed something he had already written down inside himself. Then he took a card from the pocket of his waistcoat and stepped down off the porch and crossed the yard and held the card out to her at arm's length, as if she might bite. She took it. It was a lawyer's card from Santa Fe engraved with the name of a firm on the plaza and the name Emmett Crowley beneath it in a smaller hand, and an address on Palace Avenue. If anyone should come inquiring after the property, his eyes did not quite meet hers. "Or if you should find yourself in a difficulty, my associate. A good man. He handles matters for me." He waited a beat. "He handles a great many matters." She looked at the card, and then she looked at Silas Merriweather, and something in the careful arrangement of his face told her that the card was not a kindness. It was a leash, or a warning, or a note he was slipping into her coat, so that whoever found her later would know who to write to. She could not have said which. She put the card into the pouch at her belt because it seemed impolite to hand it back, and she touched the brim of her hat to him without warmth, and she led the mule out through the gate and did not look back. The road out of Halverson's Bend ran flat and pale toward the west for about 2 miles before it began the long, lazy climb up onto the salt pan, and Josephine rode it at the walk because the mule was 17 years old, and the sun was already beginning to think about being cruel by mid-morning. The land on either side of the track was the color of old bone, and it was flatter than any table in the territory, and the only things that stood above the level of a man's knee were the greasewood clumps and the crooked stumps of yucca, and once, about 6 miles west of the station, the bleached ribcage of a cow that had died walking in some other year and been picked clean by things that never left a footprint. She rode with her hat pulled low and her collar turned up against the grit, and she watched the ground the way Ezekiel had taught her to watch it, reading the tracks of jackrabbit and coyote and the long straight prints of a pronghorn buck that had crossed her line before dawn and gone north toward the low breaks where there was said to be a seep in a good year. She stopped at mid-morning to let the mule blow, and she chewed a corner of hardtack softened in her mouth, and she did not think about Silas Merriweather or the tobacco tin under the floorboard, because a person who thinks about the wrong things in that country soon walks off her line and dies quietly in the greasewood without ever knowing what took her. By noon the wind had come up out of the south, dry and thin, and it carried the alkali dust from the salt pan in a fine white haze that dulled the sun. She stopped in the thin blue shade of a leaning ocotillo and poured a palmful of water into the crown of her hat and let the mule drink from it, because Ezekiel had told her once that a mule that would not drink was a mule that would not walk, and a mule that would not walk in country like this was a mule that would kill you. The mule drank slowly and lifted his head, and she took a swallow herself, one only, and put the water bag back and climbed into the saddle. She rode until the sun went down and camped that night in the lee of a shallow arroyo, where a stand of mesquite gave her a little windbreak and a handful of dry sticks for a fire, small enough to be useful and too small to be seen from any distance. She picketed the mule at the end of the rope and gave him a measure of the corn she had brought from the station's feed room. 3 quarts saved out of the last sack Ezekiel had bought, and she ate a strip of dried beef and 2 squares of hardtack and drank a cup of water heated in the tin cup over the coals. Then she took the brass compass out of the inner pocket of her coat and opened it in the last flicker of the fire and watched the needle settle north over the ash. It swung true, the chipped glass caught the red light. She closed the case and put it back against her ribs and lay down with her head on the saddle and slept the shallow sleep of a person who has taught herself to wake at any sound. She woke in the false dawn with the taste of ash on her teeth and a chill in her bones that had gone deeper than her blanket, and she rolled her kit and saddled the mule in the gray. And she was 2 hours west before the sun came up over the country behind her. The second day was longer than the first because the country was flatter and there was less to look at, and by afternoon her lips had split at the corners and her knees had gone stiff from the long hours in the saddle, and her shoulders ached from holding the reins one-handed against the pull of the wind. She thought of Ezekiel in his final quiet, and she thought of her mother at the kitchen table with the primer open between them. And she thought of her father with his big freighter's hands lifting her onto the seat of an ore wagon when she was small enough to fit inside his coat. And she did not weep, because weeping used water she could not spare, and because grief was a thing you carried the way you carried a load, distributed evenly and lashed down tight so it would not shift on the grade. Late in the afternoon she saw a line of dust on the horizon to the north, and she stopped the mule and watched it for a long 10 minutes. It moved from east to west at a pace faster than freight and slower than a running horse. And after a while she made out Cecil the shape of two riders in silhouette against the pale sky. And they were riding hard and they were not looking her way. She sat still until the dust had thinned and gone. She could not have said why the sight of them made the skin at the back of her neck go tight, only that Ezekiel had taught her long ago that two men riding hard through empty country on a Tuesday afternoon were seldom riding hard for a good reason, and a person who happened to be alone on a sway-backed mule in the same country had best make herself small and still until they had gone by. When she was sure they had passed, she rode on. But she rode with her jaw set now, and the reins gathered a little shorter. She camped that second night in the shadow of a low lava outcrop that broke the horizon like a black wave frozen halfway across the flat, and she made no fire. She ate hardtack cold and drank water from the bag and lay listening to the wind pull at the sparse dry grass, and she watched the stars come up so bright over the dark line of the ridge west of her that she could have counted the horses of Orion by their names. The third morning she was up in the dark and moving before the light, and she rode into a wind that had shifted in the night and now came out of the northwest with a mineral edge in it, something faintly sweet under the alkali and something metallic under that, a smell she did not have a name for. It rode the low draws like water finding its channel, and she rode into it, because Ezekiel had taught her that a smell on the wind would lead you to its source if you were patient enough to follow it, and because the only thing worse than a smell you could not name in country like that was a smell you could name and had chosen to ignore. By mid-morning the smell was stronger and the mule had begun to lift his head and turn his ears, and Josephine felt a small, quick tightening in her chest that was almost like recognition, though she could not have said of what. She had begun to believe, in the flat, sensible way a person who has spent 7 years around freight believes such things, that the smell was the smell of water, an alkali spring perhaps, one of the seeps the old freighters spoke of in the country south of the salt pan. And this made a certain sense, because Ezekiel had told her once that a spring in that country would announce itself on the wind for miles, before you saw the willow that marked it. So she turned the mule slightly to the south to follow the strongest part of the smell, and she left the compass line she had been holding since dawn. She rode south for the better part of the morning and into the early afternoon, and the smell did not grow closer and did not grow farther, and the country did not open into a green cottonwood draw or a stand of willow, and by the time the sun was 3 hands above the western ridges, she had begun to feel the first small cold recognition that the smell was not what she had thought it was. She reined the mule up on a low rise and looked around her, and there was no cottonwood and no willow and no gleam of water anywhere in any direction, only the pale caliche and the greasewood, and in the north faint and blue, the notch in the ridge she had been aiming at all along and had now put 12 or 14 miles behind her. The mule shifted under her and lowered his head, and she felt the small hollow feeling in her chest that a person gets when she understands she has been wrong for half a day and cannot afford to have been wrong for half a day. She unhooked the water bag from the saddle to take stock, and as she did she felt the canvas give in a way it should not have given, and she looked down and saw a long thin tear running along the lower seam where a mesquite thorn or an ocotillo spine had caught it that morning in the dark, and she had not noticed. The bag was half empty. The other half had been running down the mule's near flank in a slow dark stain for hours. She put her hand over the tear and closed her eyes for one long breath and did not curse aloud, because cursing used water too, and because Ezekiel had taught her that a person who cursed her own mistakes only announced them to whatever was listening. She took the compass out of her coat and opened it on her thigh and watched the needle settle. North was where north had always been. Requa Springs was north and slightly west of where she was sitting. Halverson's Bend was southeast and might as well have been on the moon. She had no map of the country between her and the notch in the ridge, but she had ridden this far on the memory of Ezekiel's voice and the swing of a needle, and she thought she could ride the rest on the same. She wet the mule's tongue with a palmful of water from what remained in the bag, and she took 2 swallows herself, and she turned the mule's head to the north and began to walk him back the way she had come. She rode through the afternoon and into the dusk, and she did not stop for a fire that night. She stopped only long enough to loosen the cinch and let the mule stand, and she drank a swallow of water and ate a piece of hardtack, and she sat with her back against a boulder still warm from the day and watched the stars come up and thought about how a person could work with a good hand for 7 years and lose everything she owned in a single week and still, in the end, be undone by a mesquite thorn she had failed to see in the dark. It was a long, quiet thought. There was no lesson in it that Ezekiel had not already put into her hands in some other shape, but the thought had a new hard, clean edge to it that she had not felt before, and she found she was almost grateful for the edge, because it belonged to her and no one else could take it. She rode through the moonlight for 3 hours because the mule could smell the cool of night and would walk in it, And when the moon dropped low, she stopped and picketed him and slept in her coat, with the compass under her cheek, and woke stiff in the false dawn and rode on. By the middle of the fourth morning, she was back on the line she should have been on the day before, and she was drinking the last of the water in swallows, so small they barely wet her tongue. And the northwest wind had brought the sweet mineral smell back to her, stronger now than it had been before, so strong that the mule was lifting his head every few steps and turning his ears forward, and if he were tracking a thing he had never smelled and did not entirely trust, she rode into it. She rode into it because there was nothing else to ride into. And because whatever was making that smell had also, whether it knew it or not, saved her from riding on straight past it into a country where the compass would have gone on pointing north, long after she had run out of any reason to look at it. She rode into it, and by the noon of that fourth day she had come to the lip of a dry wash wider than any she had crossed since leaving Halverson's Bend, its bed pale and hard and channeled where the last flash flood had run through it a summer or two before. And she pulled the mule up short at the edge and sat very still in the saddle, and she looked down. There were wagons in the wash. She counted 6 of them, drawn up in the broken line of a convoy that had tried to circle for the night and had not finished the circle. 3 abreast in front, 3 trailing behind and slightly staggered, the way wagons stagger when the last drivers in a line lose their heart for the maneuver. The canvas bonnets were bleached the color of bone. The tongues lay down in the dust where they had been dropped when the teams were cut free. The wheels stood canted where the wind and the sand had worked around the felloes. There were no mules in the traces. There were no mules anywhere. Where a team should have stood there were only pieces of cut harness, laid out in the pale dust, straight and clean, the way a careful man lays out harness when he has time to be careful and no intention of using it again. Farther off, at the very edge of what she could see from the rim, a scatter of pale bones that had once been a mule and might now in the dry cold nights have been anything. The wind that had brought her the smell was blowing directly across the wash and up over the rim into her face, and it carried the smell now so strongly that she understood at last what it was. And it was not water, and it was not any spring she had heard old freighters describe. It was the sweet dead mineral smell of silver that had lain a long time in dry country and had begun in its own slow way to speak up out of its boxes to anyone with a nose to hear it. She sat on the mule at the lip of the wash with her hand on the saddle horn and the empty water bag flat against her thigh, and looked down at the 6 broken wagons and the cut harness and the pale bones, and she felt the compass press against her ribs on one side and the lawyer's card in the pouch at her belt on the other. And she understood without any drama at all that whatever the wash held for her, it had been waiting for her, and no other rider in that country would have come down into it the way she was about to. She loosened the reins and clucked the mule forward, and the old animal stepped down over the callous edge into the wash with the small, stiff dignity of a horse who has been asked to do harder things in his life than this, and the 2 of them descended together into the shadow of the wagons and the smell of the silver, and whatever else was down there in the pale dust waiting for a girl of 18, with $11 folded into the lining of her coat. The mule picked his way down the Callish slope with the flat, unhurried care of an animal who has decided that a bad grade taken slowly is better than a broken foreleg taken fast, and Josephine let him choose the line. She did not touch the reins beyond a fingertip on the near side. Halfway to the floor of the wash, she felt the wind drop away entirely, cut off by the walls, and the smell of the silver rose up around her thick as syrup, no longer riding on any current but simply present, as if the wash itself were breathing it out through the seams of the crates below. At the bottom she swung down. Her knees buckled once under her weight, and she caught herself on the saddle horn and stood a moment letting her legs remember what they were for. The mule stood with his head low, ribs working. She led him by the reins along the tail of the convoy and tied him to a spoke of the rearmost wagon where a strip of shade lay in a narrow blue band beside the wheel. She poured what water was left in the bag into the tin cup and offered it to him. He drank it in 3 long pulls, and she watched him drink with the small quiet ache of a person who has just given away the last of a thing she will need again before nightfall. Then she turned to look at the convoy properly. She counted 6 wagons a second time to be certain, because Ezekiel had taught her long ago that a person who counted a thing once in country like this had only guessed. The lead wagon lay canted on its offside with the rear axle snapped clean through, and one wheel gone entirely from the hub, spokes scattered in a pale fan across the caliche where the impact had thrown them. The second stood mostly upright but had settled to its axles in a soft patch where the last flood had left the sand loose. The third had lost most of its bonnet to the wind, and its rib framing stood exposed against the sky like the skeleton of a small ship. The fourth, fifth, and sixth had drawn up tighter behind, canvas mostly intact in the ragged hope of a defensive circle that had never been finished. She walked the line slowly, hand trailing along the sun-warmed boards, her boots making small dry sounds in the caliche. She did not touch the crates. Not yet. She had been raised by two careful people and then by a third, and none of them had ever taught her to grab. 3 men lay in the shade of the wagons. One was still in his coat, propped against a rear wheel of the second wagon, as if he had sat down to rest and never risen. And a canteen was still strapped diagonally across his chest, and when she lifted it with 2 fingers of her right hand, it was light as a whisper. The second man had crawled some distance out into the wash and had lain down face down with his arms folded beneath his forehead in a posture so peaceful. It took her a slow moment to understand that he had died in it. The third was only bones now, and a hat, and a pair of boots with the leather cracked white by 4 cycles of frost and sun, and she could not tell whether he had been the youngest of them or the oldest. She had seen dead men before. 2 at the mining camp above Thistlewood when a hoist cable had parted, and 1 on the Halverson Road when a driver had been pinned by his own tongue in a runaway. But she had never seen 3 at once who had died together and been left where they lay, and the wrongness of it settled into her chest not as horror but as a kind of solemn attention, the way a person becomes attentive in a church without knowing why. She took off her hat for a moment and stood with the sun full on her uncovered head, and she put it back on and she went to work. The freight was Studebaker built, and the paint on the boards had been the deep brick red of a good South Bend factory finish before 4 months of desert sun had bled it back toward gray. The iron tires were still sound. The king bolts had not been drawn. The lead wagon's snapped axle told her the whole story of the last hour of the convoy in a single line, because a snapped axle and soft calish meant a team driven hard by men who had understood that stopping was worse than breaking a wheel, and the fact that the wheel had come off after the axle had gone told her the driver had tried to run on 3 for at least 100 yards. She could see the drag mark in the pale sand where the wagon had finally slewed sideways and stopped. She counted what she could see through the torn canvas of the second wagon. Barrels of flour with the staves bulged from 4 seasons of dry coarse cornmeal and cotton sacks gone yellow. A keg of blackstrap molasses split along the seam and long since crusted into a dark rock. A sack of pinto beans burst open at one corner and half emptied by rats and desert birds who had come and gone. Ordinary provisions. Freight of the sort that moved between any 2 mining camps in the territory on any Tuesday of any month. But behind the flour barrels, stacked tight and low against the wagon's forward bulkhead, were small square crates of a size and construction she had never seen on any freight bill Ezekiel had ever read out at the kitchen table. They were banded in iron across the top and along both long edges. The pine was tight-grained, planed smooth, without a notch show, stenciled only with numbers in a black ink that had faded almost to gray. No consignee, no destination, no weight declared. She laid her palm flat on the top of the nearest crate. The wood was hot from the sun. Underneath the heat, through the boards, she could feel the weight of what was in them the way a person can feel a river running under a bridge without seeing it. She counted 12 such crates in the second wagon. She climbed up onto the sideboard of the third and counted 8 more visible under the ripped canvas. The fourth was too tightly packed to count clearly from the outside, but she could see enough to know there were more, and she understood, standing there with her boot on the hub and one hand shading her eyes, that the ordinary flour and beans and cornmeal in the front of each wagon had been loaded to disguise what was in the back. The convoy had not been a supply run at all, it had been dressed as one. She went back to the mule and got down the horn-handled knife and the farrier's rasp, and she set to work on the topmost crate in the second wagon with the patience Ezekiel had taught her, which was the patience of a person who means to open a thing without ruining what is inside, so that the thing can be closed again and a man riding past at a distance will see only what he had seen before. She worked one iron band up nail by nail. She kept each nail in the crown of her hat as she pulled it, laying them in a small neat curve along the sweatband. She pried the pine boards loose along the grain, because green pine will split lengthwise if you hurry it and betray its opener to anyone with an eye. When the lid came free, she set it aside on the wagon floor and folded back a layer of oiled canvas that had been laid across the top of the contents, and she stopped. Ingots of silver lay packed in sawdust in the crate, wrapped each in its own square of waxed paper. The paper had gone brittle in the dry. The tops of the ingots were dull gray where the air had touched them, and bright as new coin along one corner where a bar had rubbed against its neighbor in the long shifting of the desert road. They were stamped along the crown with a die she did not recognize. Not the mark of any territorial mint she had ever heard Ezekiel name. She counted the ingots in the crate she had opened. 20. She counted the visible crates again. She did the arithmetic without moving her lips, the way her mother had taught her to at the kitchen table with the primer between them. She sat back on her heels in the shade of the torn canvas and looked at the silver for a long minute and did not touch it. Ezekiel had told her once, in the tack room at Halverson's Bend, that the difference between a person who kept her hands and a person who did not was the second minute after finding something valuable, because in the first minute anyone alive would want it and no one could be blamed. But by the second minute, a person had begun to decide what kind of story she was going to be part of. Josephine sat in the second minute. She heard the wind pull at the ragged bonnet above her head, and the small, dry rustle of the waxed paper stirring in the draft. She stood up. She went forward along the line to the lead wagon, where the man in the coat sat propped against the wheel. She did not want to search him, but she had been raised on the road, and she knew what a wagon master carried, and she knew where he carried it. She said a small word under her breath that was not quite a prayer and was not quite an apology, only an acknowledgement that a decent thing was about to be done in an indecent way. Then she knelt beside the driver and unbuttoned his coat with careful fingers and searched the inside pocket, and found only a folded handkerchief and a set of tally sticks tied with twine. She patted the coat down and found nothing more. She stood back and looked at the wagon itself, and after a moment she saw what the driver had done in his last hour, which was to slide a thin plank of pine crooked along the underside of the buckboard seat where it should have lain flush. She reached under the seat and worked the plank loose. Behind it, in a shallow cavity built between the buckboard and the front bulkhead, she found a flat tin box the size of a small book and a canvas satchel wrapped tight in a square of black oilcloth. She lifted them both out into the light and set them on the wagon floor and squatted beside them. The tin box was heavy in a way that told her what it held before she opened it. Inside, packed in strips of newspaper folded to keep them from rattling, were paper rolls of double-eagle gold coin. She counted them without breaking the rolls. 15 rolls. 20 coins to a roll by the standard bank wrap, plus one loose stack of 11 laid in the corner. She did the numbers again, 311 coins at $20 each, $6,220. She sat still with the box open on her knees. The satchel held 4 things wrapped separately in scraps of clean muslin. A folded waybill on stiff freighter's paper stamped with the seal of a shipping firm out of Fort Purgatory, whose name she had heard Ezekiel mentioned twice in her life. A small, leather-bound book the size of a prayer book with a worn spine and a brass hasp that had been left unlocked. A horn-handled pocket knife with a bone inlay so worn smooth by a man's thumb that the pattern of the horn showed through in a faint whorl. And a letter, 4 pages long, written in a slow, careful hand in pencil on the ruled paper of a freighter's ledger, folded once and addressed on the outside in the same pencil to whoever finds this. She sat down against the near wheel of the lead wagon in the strip of shade the wagon itself made, and she took her hat off and laid it beside her with its careful hoard of nails in the crown, and she unfolded the letter across her knees. My name is Barnaby Threlkeld, and I have been a wagon master on the southern freight roads for 26 years, and if you are reading this, then I did not come through, and neither did the wagons, and neither did my men. I am writing this on the second night out of Fort Purgatory with the fire low and the men asleep, because I have hauled a great many loads in my time, but I have never hauled one I liked less than this. And a man who does not like his load ought to write down what he knows, in case the load turns out to be the last of him. Josephine let the first page settle onto her thigh and read on. The crates in the second wagon and in the third and the fourth and the fifth and the sixth are silver bullion belonging to no company that will admit to owning it. It is the private stake of certain gentlemen in the territorial house at Prescott, who mean to have it out of the reach of the federal auditors coming down from Washington in the spring. I am hired through a broker in Santa Fe whose name I will not put on this page because the writing of a name of that kind is the kind of thing that gets found on a man in a wash. But I will say this. The broker is a lawyer, and he keeps an office on the plaza, and he wears a black frock coat, and he does not shake hands. Josephine read that paragraph twice, and her mouth went dry around the taste of alkali dust. She thought of the card in the pouch at her belt. She did not take it out, not yet. The gold in the tin under my seat is my own honest wage of 11 years put by against my niece, who is 8 years old this October and lives with my late sister's widow at Fort Cottonwood. Her name is Hattie Threlkeld. Her father was killed in a mine cave-in the year she was born, and her mother followed him 3 winters later of the same lung fever that carried the men out of every camp in that country the year Grant left the White House. The child has nobody but the aunt, and the aunt has nothing but what I send. I have carried this gold with me on this run because I meant to leave the road after this haul and take the money to the child in person on the way home, and buy the aunt a good milk cow and a proper stove, and see the girl put into a decent day school. That was my intention on the morning of the 3rd of October, when we rolled out of Fort Purgatory at first light. If you are the one that finds us, take the gold first, because it is mine to give, and I give it to you to carry to the child. Take of the silver what you have honest need of, and no more, because the silver was never mine, and it is not yours either. But a girl who has crossed the country I think you have crossed to reach this wash has earned a finder's wage as fair as any man ever earned one. She stopped reading. She put her palm flat on the page. She looked up over the top of the wagon at the sky, which had begun to yellow toward evening, and she thought of an 8-year-old girl in a place she had never been, who did not yet know that the world had, that morning, decided to be kinder to her than it had been in the whole of her small life. And Josephine felt something turn over in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite anger, only a very old and very quiet recognition that certain kinds of men wrote letters in the second night of a bad run because they knew, without being told, that a girl was coming for whom the letter would matter. She read on "Get word by any decent hand to a man named Cornelius Ashby at the assay office in Requa Springs. Ashby is a friend of 30 years, and he will know what is to be done with the silver, and he will see that Hattie gets her share of the gold in the manner I have set out, and he will keep it out of the hands that mean to grab it. Trust him and no other man in that country. Do not carry the letter to the marshal at Prescott. Do not send word ahead. Ride in quiet and give the letter to Ashby by his own hand." Josephine let out a slow breath. The last page went on in the same slow, careful hand. "I rode with a freighter out of Thistlewood Crossing many years ago, whose name was Nathaniel Ainsworth, and he was as straight a man as ever set a brake on a bad grade, and his older brother Ezekiel rode second wagon behind me for a season on the Fort Yuma run. And if either of those men or any of their people are still living in the territory, you might ask after them, for their sort is the sort I would trust with what I have written here. I am tired tonight. The wind is up. The mules are restless. I hope, whoever you are, you got here in better shape than we did. And I hope you go home from here, wherever home is for you. And I hope the child never has to know the small, ugly details of how the money reached her, only that it did. Barnaby Threlcold, Wagon Man." The second night out of Fort Purgatory, October 4th. She read the letter through a second time, more slowly. And when she came the second time to the name Nathaniel Ainsworth, written in the slow, careful pencil of a man she had never met, she put the pages down flat on her knee and pressed her palm against them and did not move for a long while. The wind pulled at the torn canvas above her head. The sweet mineral smell of the silver rose up out of the open crate in the second wagon and drifted along the line of the convoy and settled around her like a weather she had walked into and could not step out of. Her father's name in another man's handwriting on the fourth page of a letter written by lantern light against a wagon wheel 4 months before, addressed to a stranger who had not yet arrived. Ezekiel had told her once, in the tack room at Halverson's Bend, that the world had a way of setting a table for certain people, and then waiting a long time for those people to come to the table, and that the important thing was to sit down when the table was set, because most people did not, and most tables were finally cleared away without anyone eating. She sat down at the table. She folded the letter along its old crease and slid it back inside the muslin with the leather-bound book and the horn-handled knife and the waybill. She opened the leather-bound book because Barnaby had said trust no other man in that country, and she wanted to know what a man like Barnaby Threlkeld had thought worth binding. The book was a ledger of a kind, but not a freighter's ledger. It was smaller and denser. The first 3 pages were dates and place names in the same slow, careful hand as the letter. The dates ran back 4 years, the place names she recognized, most of them. Prescott, Santa Fe, Fort Purgatory, Yuma, Tucson. Beside each date and place was a set of initials, and beside each set of initials a small notation in what she took at first for shorthand. She turned the pages. Halfway through the book, the shorthand thickened, and she began to see that it was not shorthand at all but a code. Letters substituted for letters in a pattern that had been meant to defeat a casual reader without defeating the writer. She was not a woman who solved ciphers by candlelight, but she could see in the pattern of the substitutions and the recurring frequencies of certain 3-letter groupings that the book was a register of transactions, and that certain initials appeared over and over again in connection with certain other initials, and that the initials had been listed in the front of the book on a page she had missed and now turned back to. There were 7 sets of initials on the front page. The last set on the list was E, and beside it, in a small neat hand, the word Santa Fe Plaza Office. Josephine took the pouch from her belt and drew out the lawyer's card. Silas Merriweather had pressed on her in the yard at Halverson's Bend at first light on a morning 8 days ago that felt now like it had happened to some other girl in some other life. She turned the card over in her fingers. Emmett Crowley, attorney at law, the Plaza Santa Fe EC. She set the card down beside the ledger. She looked at the two of them lying together in the pale, callous dust of the wagon floor. She understood in that moment with a slow, clean certainty that was not fear and was not triumph, but something more useful than either, that Silas Merriweather had not been merely a soft man in a black coat who had ridden out from Santa Fe with a lawyer's paper to seize a plank house and a tobacco tin. Silas Merriweather had been the small, polite front of a thing much larger than himself, and the card in her pouch had not been a courtesy. It had been a mark. A note dropped into the coat pocket of a girl he expected to disappear into empty country, so that if she did not disappear, if she turned up in some other town speaking of what she had found, there would already be a man in Santa Fe with a firm on the plaza who could be reached quickly and could handle the matter, whatever the matter turned out to be. He had known. or he had suspected, or he had been told to hand the card out to any young person leaving the plank house alone as a precaution, so that the machinery of Emmett Crowley's Santa Fe office would already have a name to attach to a face when the moment came. She could not know which of these was true. She knew only that the card and the ledger had come to lie beside each other in the same wash on the same afternoon, and that the coincidence of it was not a coincidence at all, but the small quiet click of a lock she had not known she was inside. She put the card back into the pouch. She closed the leather book and wrapped it again in its muslin. She sat still for a long minute with her hands flat on her thighs and listened to the wind and the small creak of the wagons settling as the sun moved off them, and she thought she could take everything, the gold and the silver both. She could load the mule to the point of foundering with as many ingots as he could carry, and she could ride south into the border country by way of the old ferry crossing at San Bernardino Springs, and she could live the rest of her life in a small white house in a dusty river town where no man had ever heard the name Ainsworth. She thought about it clearly, and without pretending she had not thought about it, because pretending was a form of dishonesty Ezekiel had never taught her. Then she set the thought down beside the card and the ledger and looked at all three of them together. And she understood that the small white house in the river town would be a house full of Emmett Crowley's men within a year, because a girl who took what did not belong to her told the world where to send its collectors, and Ezekiel had raised no such girl. She could burn the ledger. She could carry the gold to Requa Springs and forget the silver and forget the code and let the wash keep its secrets. And she could deliver Hattie Threlkeld's inheritance and take her honest wage and lose herself in the small daily work of the assay office and never say the name Emmett Crowley aloud. That was the safest thing. That was the thing Ezekiel might have done at 18, if Ezekiel had ever been 18 in a country that offered such choices. She thought about that too. She sat with it a long minute. Then she closed her hands into fists on her thighs and opened them again, and she understood that she could not do the safe thing either, because the code in the book was not only about silver, and it was not only about the 7 men whose initials Barnaby had listed on the front page. It was a map of a machine, and the machine had already put a card into her pouch that morning at Halverson's Bend, and the machine would put cards into other pouches in other yards on other mornings, and other girls of 18 would ride out with $11 folded into the linings of their coats, and would not have the luck of a sway-backed mule and a mineral wind and a wash full of dead men to teach them what the card was. Ezekiel had told her once in the corral at Halverson's Bend with the sun going down behind the mule shed that a person who saw a mean dog off its chain and walked past it in silence had helped chain the next child that dog would bite. She had been 13 when he told her that. She had not entirely understood it then. She understood it now. She took 4 ingots of silver from the open crate and no more. She wrapped them in a torn strip of the wagon bonnet, one to a corner, and knotted the strip to make a small heavy bundle she could lash behind her cantle. She reset the iron bands on the crate and pressed the saved nails home with the flat of the rasp, working each one down flush with the wood so that a man riding along the rim of the wash would see only what he had seen before, which was 6 broken wagons and no reason to dissent. She folded the oiled canvas back over the neat rows of remaining ingots and closed the crate and slid it back into place among its neighbors and turned away. She took the tin box of gold coin, every roll of it, $6,220 if her arithmetic held. Not for her. She lashed the box behind the cantle beside the bundle of silver. She took the satchel with the letter and the ledger and the horn-handled knife and the waybill. She did not open the ledger again. She wrapped the satchel in a second layer of the wagon bonnet and tied it against the near side of the saddle where it would ride against her thigh. She went to the 3 men in the shade one at a time. The man in the coat with the empty canteen, the man face down with his arms folded beneath him, the bones and the hat and the cracked boots. She tore strips of the least ragged bonnet canvas and covered each of them from head to foot, and she weighed the corners of the canvas with stones from the wash floor so that the wind would not lift the covers off them in the night. She said over each of them the same plain words her mother had said over a neighbor's grave in Thistlewood Crossing when Josephine was 7 years old, that the ground was patient and that the wind was kind and that the rest was not for her to know. She did not know whether the words meant anything to a man in a canvas shroud in a dry wash in the Arizona Territory, but she knew they had meant something to her mother, who had taught school for $22 a month and had never in her life let a person go into the ground without a word said over her, and this was enough. She stood a moment beside the man in the coat propped against the wheel, whose face she had not uncovered, and whose name she believed she now knew. Barnaby Threlkeld, wagon master, 26 years on the southern freight roads. He had written 4 pages in pencil on a second night out of Fort Purgatory, because he had understood in some quiet corner of himself that the load he did not like would kill him, And he had wanted a girl he could not name to come to a wash he could not describe and find a letter that would save an 8-year-old child what he had loved for 11 years. He had guessed right on almost everything. He had been wrong only about the shape of the girl, which he could not have known, and about the small extra things she was going to do with the leather-bound book he had not entirely trusted her with, because trust of that size was too much to give to a stranger in a letter. He had left the book anyway, in case she was the sort who would open it. She was the sort who would open it. She turned the mule. She led him back down the line to the tail of the convoy where she had tied him and gave him a last swallow of the water from the split keg, which he refused with the small, stiff dignity that had brought him down the Callish slope, and she gave him what was left in her own bag, which was almost nothing, and she checked the cinch and the lashings behind the cantle a final time. The bundle of silver sat square against the tin box of gold. The satchel of paper and horn and leather rode against her right knee. The $11, less of them now, still lay flat against her ribs in the lining of her coat on the same side as the compass. She swung into the saddle. She turned the mule's nose to the north-northwest. Along the line the compass had held for her all the way from Halverson's Bend, and she rode out of the wash the way she had come in, up the slope of Callish where the mule chose his own footing, and she did not look back at the wagons because looking back would not have added anything to what she had already seen. At the top of the rim she reined the mule up and sat a moment. The sun was low now, and it lay along the flats behind her in a long molten band, and the wash was already sinking into blue shadow, and the 6 wagons in it were becoming again what they had been to any passing rider for 4 months, which was a scatter of broken shapes in a bad piece of country worth no man's descent. She could still smell the silver faintly on the wind. In another hour the desert cold would come up and the smell would drop, and by morning a man riding the rim would smell only greasewood and dust. And this was the small mercy the country would extend to Barnaby Threlkeld's plan on his behalf. She turned the mule's head and let him go. She rode until the moon came up, and when it did she rode by moonlight for another 2 hours, because the mule could smell the cool of the higher country ahead and would walk toward it. She made a cold camp in the lee of a stand of pinon on a low rise, and she picketed the mule and stood beside him in the dark and put her forehead against his shoulder and stayed that way for a long minute. He blew warm breath into her collar. His hide smelled of sweat and dust and the dry, sweet smell that a working animal has at the end of a hard day. And she was suddenly, briefly, so grateful for the fact of him that she could not speak. She ate a piece of hardtack cold. She drank 3 swallows from the ruined bag, which was almost the last of what it had. She lay down with her head on the saddle and the satchel beside her hand, and she did not sleep for a long time, though she was tired to the bone. She thought about Emmett Crowley in an office on the plaza in Santa Fe. And she thought about Silas Merriweather in the room that had been hers at Halverson's Bend. And she thought about Cornelius Ashby, whom she had never seen and knew only by a name in a dead man's letter, and she wondered what it would be like to walk into an assay office in a town where nobody knew her, and to lay a letter and a book and a horn-handled knife on the counter, and to say the words that would set in motion a great machine she could not control and could not entirely predict. She thought about Hattie Threlkeld, 8 years old, in a settlement she had never seen. And she thought about the milk cow and the proper stove in the day school, and she thought that these were the small, honest things a wagon master had died for, and that she was now, by a chain of accidents that had not felt like accidents, the person who would put those things into that child's life. She thought, too, about her mother, who would have understood what she had done in the wash without a word being said about it, and about Ezekiel, who would have understood it without any words at all, and would perhaps only have grunted once and refilled his coffee. And she thought about her father, whom she remembered less clearly with each passing year, but whose name lay now inside the oilcloth on the satchel against her thigh, in another man's careful pencil, alive again in a way she had not thought a dead father's name could be made alive. She slept at last, thinly, with one hand on the satchel and the other loose against the compass in her coat. She was up before first light. The mule was standing when she woke, watching her with the patient, interested attention of an animal who has decided that the person he is with is a person worth staying with. She saddled him and checked the lashings and swung up in the gray, and she rode into a wind that smelled at last only of cold rock and the resin of pinyon. No metal in it, no sweetness, only the honest, clean smell of country that had never held a secret worth killing for. She was on the north-northwest line she had been on since she had turned back from her mistake, and the low blue ridge that held Requa Springs in its notch was closer now, close enough to see the individual shoulders of it against the paling sky, close enough that she could pick out the dark, ragged pass where the road came through. She rode. She rode all that day at the walk because the mule was 17, and the country was still rough underfoot and there was no point in arriving lame. She stopped once at mid-morning, where a stripe of shade lay under a leaning slab of red rock, and she watered the mule from her own bag with what was left, and she counted for the first time what she had. $11 less the 70 cents she had spent at the stage station on the water bag and the hardtack. 4 ingots of silver of a weight she could estimate to a pound and no closer. A tin box of gold coin whose exact number she now knew. A satchel of paper and a horn-handled knife and a leather-bound book whose code she could not read but could recognize as a code, and whose front page held the name of a lawyer whose card lay in her pouch, and a brass compass and a farrier's rasp and a horn-handled knife of her own, and the second dress in the flour sack behind the candle and a mule she loved. She counted these things over slowly in her head, the way Ezekiel had counted a load before he set out. It was, she understood, a considerable inventory. It was more than she had ever owned, and it was more than she had been raised to want. She thought briefly of the small white house in the river town, and she set the thought down again and did not pick it back up. By afternoon, the ridges to the west had begun to fold together the way ridges do when a person nears them, and the road she had been paralleling for 2 days had bent up toward the notch. And by evening she could see, far off in the last of the light, a small dark cluster on the shoulder of the pass where the road went through. She did not push the mule. She camped the last night in a thicket of manzanita half a mile off the road, and she ate her last squares of hardtack and drank the last of her water, and she lay awake looking up at the stars which had come up brighter than she had ever seen them, so bright that the paling of dawn came almost as a disappointment. She thought once, in the middle of that last night, that she was carrying on her saddle a thing that could kill her if the wrong man laid a hand on it, and she felt the fear of it move through her like a small cold current, and she let it move, and she let it go, and she found that the fear did not stay long because the plan she had made in the wash was a plan she believed in, and belief in a plan was a heavier ballast than fear. The sun came up on the last morning of the ride, and Josephine Ainsworth rose in the gray and rolled her blanket and saddled the mule one more time. She took the compass out of her coat and opened it in her palm and watched the needle settle north-northwest. She closed the case and put it away. The chipped glass caught a splinter of the coming light as she closed it, and she thought, as she had thought at every camp since leaving Halverson's Bend, that a needle that swung true was a small enough thing to be grateful for at the end of a hard day. She mounted, she turned the mule's head. She rode toward the notch in the ridge and the small dark cluster of buildings on its shoulder, and she carried on her saddle the letter of a dead man, and the honest wage of 11 years, and the coded ledger of a machine, and the 4 ingots of a wage she had not yet been offered, and the 11 silver dollars of the sale of a mule she was still riding. And she rode into the town of Requa Springs at mid-morning, up the single dusty street between the livery at the south end and the church without a bell at the north, and she pulled the mule up in front of the assay office under its nickel-gray tin awning, and she dismounted, and she stood a moment on the boardwalk with her hand on the mule's neck, and then she gathered the satchel and the tin box and the bundle of silver from behind her cantle, and she opened the door. The door of the assay office gave under her hand with the small sticky resistance of pine that had swelled once in a wet season a decade back and never quite settled again. A brass bell above the frame gave one dry chirp as she stepped inside, and the smell of the room came up to meet her all at once. Coal smoke banked low in an iron stove that stood cold at this hour, and the faint acid tang of the test bench under the far window, and the older smell of paper that had lain a long time in a dry country and had gone slightly brittle at its edges without ever going yellow. A counter of oiled walnut ran the length of the front wall. A brass scale stood at one end of it with its arms swung level and its pans empty. A ledger lay open on a slant desk at the other end with a black-handled pen laid across the crease. Behind the counter, on a stool with a green baize cushion, sat a small square-shouldered man of about 60, in a collarless shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, working ink into the fingers of his right hand from a stone bottle. He looked up. His eyebrows had gone entirely white, though the hair on his head was still mostly the iron color of a man who had been dark young. His spectacles sat halfway down his nose in the manner of a man who used them for close work and preferred not to bother with them for the rest of his life. His eyes were a pale gray that held on Josephine for a beat longer than a stranger's eyes usually held on a person coming through a door, and she understood without needing to be told that Cornelius Ashby was a man who had learned, at some cost, to read a room and its occupant in the space between one breath and the next. She set the tin box on the counter first, then the wrapped bundle of the 4 ingots. Then she took Barnaby Threlcold's oilcloth satchel from under her arm and untied the cord and laid the letter out flat, all 4 pages, with the second page turned so the sentence about the men in the territorial house sat directly under Ashby's eye. She laid the horn-handled pocket knife with the bone inlay across the corner of the pages where the pencil had gone faint. She stepped back 1 pace from the counter and folded her hands loose at her waist and waited. Ashby set his stone bottle down. He did not touch the letter yet. He looked at the knife for a long moment first, and something moved in his face that was not quite grief and not quite recognition, but had the shape of both. Then he settled his spectacles up his nose with a knuckle and bent to the pages and began to read. He read all 4 pages without moving. He read them a second time. When he was done, he took the spectacles off and folded them and laid them on the counter beside the knife. And he rubbed the bridge of his nose with a thumb and forefinger, and he closed his eyes for the space of one long breath and opened them again. So he is dead then. The voice came out quiet, no rise or fall in it, the voice of a man saying aloud a thing he had already been carrying for some time in the private back room of himself and had only been waiting for permission to set down. In a wash 2.5 days east, she kept her hands where they were, 3 men. He was propped against a wheel of the lead wagon. He had his coat on. Ashby nodded once, his eyes did not leave hers. You opened his crates, one of them. On the top of the second wagon. To know what I was looking at, how many did you take? 4 bars and every coin in the tin. The coins are not mine and I know it. I brought them because he wrote for me to bring them, and because they are for a child, and because a man who dies writing a letter to a child ought to have the letter answered. He held her look. She held his. Something in his face settled the way a beam settles in an old house when the last of the weight comes onto it correctly. He drew the tin box across the counter to himself and lifted the lid and looked inside at the wrapped rolls of double eagles without touching them. He closed the lid again. His voice had gone careful, the way a man's voice goes careful when he means to ask a question the answer to which will determine everything that follows. May I have your name? Josephine Ainsworth. My father was Nathaniel. My uncle was Ezekiel. Both dead. Something changed in Ashby's eyes, not surprise. More like the small, quiet click of a lock in his own memory. Nathaniel Ainsworth's daughter. He said it as if he were setting a place at a table. Barnaby Road, second wagon behind your uncle on the Yuma Road, spring of '68. I was clerking then at the assay office in Ehrenberg. Your father brought a load of ore across my counter in April of that year, and he had a small girl on the seat beside him who could not have been more than a year old, and he was fool proud of her, and he set her on my counter and let her pull the arm of my scale to see it swing. I have not thought of that afternoon in 15 years. His pale eyes rested on her, and it seemed to Josephine that he was seeing 2 people at once. The woman across his counter and the small child on the counter of another office, a long day's ride and a long lifetime ago. You came in through the flats, I did. On that mule out front. On that mule. Alone. He nodded slowly, as if the alone confirmed some private arithmetic he had been doing since she came through his door. Then he stood down off his stool and walked to the front window and turned the key in the latch and drew the curtain across. And he crossed to the door she had come in by and turned its own bolt. And he came back around the counter and lifted a panel of the walnut on its hinges and held it up. Come through, Miss Ainsworth. My back room is a better place for what you have brought me than a counter that faces the street. She stepped through. He let the panel down behind her and led her past the test bench with its small array of Blackstones and dropper bottles, into a low ceilinged room at the rear that held a second stove, cold at this hour, and a table of scoured pine, and a beam scale of the finer sort. And along one wall a squat green iron safe with a brass dial worn to a soft shine by the fingers of a man who opened it every morning of his working life. He set the tin box on the table, he set the 4 ingots beside it. He fetched a second lamp from a shelf and lit it against the dimness of the shuttered room. And he took down from a peg above the stove a small ledger bound in black cloth that had the look of a book kept for private purposes and not for the daylight world of the front counter. He laid the ledger open on the table and dipped his pen and printed at the head of a fresh page. In the neat clerkly hand of a man who had been printing headings for 40 years, the words Threlkeld Trust. We will count the coin first. I want the number written down in my hand and yours before either of us has been out of this room. They counted. Ashby unwrapped the paper rolls one at a time and laid the coins in short stacks of 5 across the pine. He worked with the quick, soft touch of a man who had counted so much gold in his life that the metal made almost no sound against the wood. Josephine called the stacks 20 per roll, then a loose stack of 11 at the end. 311 double eagles at $20 a coin. $6,220 in gold. Ashby wrote the number in the black ledger and turned the book toward her, and she took the pen from his hand and signed her name beneath his. Under the column marked witness, in the same steady script, Ezekiel had drilled into her at the kitchen table before she had ever seen a saddle. Ashby turned to the 4 ingots. He set each one on the beam scale in turn and read off the weight to a quarter grain and wrote it down. He touched the corner of one bar with a drop from a small dropper bottle and pressed it to a smooth black stone from a wooden tray, and he watched the streak, and he grunted once softly at what he saw. He looked up at her. You know what the stamp on these bars is? No. Neither do I, which is a thing. I have kept this office 31 years, and I know the die of every mint that has ever stamped a legal bar of silver in this territory or any adjoining one, and I have never seen this die, which means it was struck privately at a private mill, by a private hand, for private mint. Barnaby was not a man who used a strong word without meaning to. When he wrote in that letter that this silver belonged to no company that would admit to owning it, he was telling you the plain fact of the thing. Ashby laid his fingertip on the corner of the topmost bar. This did not come out of the ground for the benefit of the territory. It came out of the ground for the benefit of 7 or 8 men who are presently drawing pay from the territory to see that certain things do not happen. And this is 9/10 of the reason why Barnaby is where he is, and his men with him. Josephine reached into the pouch at her belt and took out the leather-bound book. She set it on the pine table beside the ledger. She rested her hand on it for a moment, and then she drew from the pouch the lawyer's card Silas Merriweather had put into her hand at first light on a morning 9 days ago, and laid it on top of the book. She did not speak. She let the two objects lie there and let Ashby come to them at his own pace. He picked up the card first. He read the name and the address and the small careful lettering, and his face did not change, but the hand that held the card went very still on the pine. "Where did you come by this?" she told him. "Halverson's Bend. The porch." Silas in his shirt sleeves with the empty morning light on his spectacles. The bare kindness of a man who had made a small point of pressing the card into her palm before she rode out. She told it in the plain flat way Ezekiel had taught her to make a report of a bad crossing. No color added to it and none subtracted. Ashby set the card down beside the black ledger. He opened the leather-bound book. He read the front page with the 7 sets of initials. He read the last set, EC Santa Fe Plaza office. He turned 3 more pages, his mouth thinned. He closed the book. "Miss Ainsworth, are you aware of what you have carried into this office?" "I am aware of enough." "You have carried in the private register of a broker who was clever enough to keep his book in a code his own men could not read at a table, and honest enough or scared enough to keep it at all. That book is not the sort of thing a man like Emmett Crowley loses without noticing. If it was in the satchel under Barnaby's seat, it was because Barnaby took it off the broker at some point, or was given it, or lifted it from a locked drawer in a Santa Fe hotel while the broker was at supper. Any of the 3 is a hanging matter in a certain kind of company. Barnaby knew that he carried it anyway. He carried it because he meant to break the ring, and he did not live to break it, and he left the breaking of it, if I read the letter right, to whoever came in behind him with the sense to open the book." She let out a breath she had not known she was holding. "I opened it." "You did." A small dry warmth had come into his voice, the first she had heard in him. "You did, and you brought it here, which is the second harder thing. And you brought it with the card of the man in it laid on top of it like a place marker in a hymnal, so that the old man on the stool could not miss the point. That is a considerable morning's work, Miss Ainsworth." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Ashby closed the book and set it in the center of the pine table, and he crossed to the green iron safe and worked the dial with the small deft motions of long use. He swung the door open. He laid the tin box of gold inside on a middle shelf, and the 4 ingots beside it on a lower one, and the leather-bound book on the top shelf, wrapped now in a second square of oilcloth from a drawer, with the lawyer's card slid between its pages as a marker. He closed the safe. He turned the dial 2 full revolutions. He set his palm flat on the door for a moment, as a man will do who is committing a thing to the keeping of a place he trusts. "Now, Deputy Delacroix, he is a fair man. 6 years in the badge, Louisiana boy, came up through the river trade, does not like his job on his bad days and does not shirk it on his worst. We will walk to his office directly. You will tell him what you told me. Not the book yet. Not the car. Only the watch, and the wagon, and the letter, and the coin, and the 4 bars. That is the story that goes into a bound daybook and gets signed. The book and the card do not go into a daybook, not in this town, not this week. Those go to a man in Prescott, whose name I will not say aloud, in a room with a window in it, by a hand that I will choose myself and by a road I will pick." She nodded once. She understood the shape of what he was proposing, and she understood the weight of it, and she found she was willing to carry her share. They walked out into the street together at the middle of the morning. The dust of the day had begun to rise off the boardwalks under the boots of men going about ordinary business. The livery at the south end had its doors thrown wide, and a hostler was walking a bay gelding on a shortened lead. A woman in a plain gray dress was sweeping the porch of a dry goods store across the road. The mule stood where Josephine had left him, hip-shot at the rail in front of the assay office, and he lifted his head when he saw her and gave the small, quiet blow that a mule gives to a person he has decided is his. She laid a hand on his shoulder in passing and left him standing. Deputy Hiram Delacroix was 36, broad in the shoulders and narrow in the hip, with the sun-cracked cheekbones of a man who had spent most of the last decade out of doors, and he heard Josephine's account through without interruption, seated on a cane-backed chair with a bound daybook open on his knee and a pencil moving steadily down the page. When she was done, he set the pencil down and looked at her across the small office for a long minute. "You brought in every coin. Yes, you could have kept them." "I could have. I did not." His look shifted to Ashby, standing quietly by the door with his hat in his hand. Some silent thing passed between the two men. Delacroix turned back to Josephine. "I will need to ride out to the wash tomorrow at first light with a wagon and 4 men to bring the bones in. I would like you to ride with us if you are able." "I will. I would also like your signature at the foot of what I have written." She stepped to the chair and took the pencil and signed her name beneath his, the same clean small script she had put in Ashby's private ledger an hour before. She stepped out of the deputy's office into the middle of the day and stood a moment on the boardwalk with the sun full on her face. And it occurred to her, in a way that surprised her, that she had not been afraid at any point in the room behind her. She had been very tired and she had been careful of her words. But the fear she had lived with in the wash and on the ride in had gone out of her. While she was speaking, the way a fever goes out of a body once it has done its work. She stood in the sun a minute and let the absence of it settle in her. The riding party went out at dawn the next morning, and Josephine rode in the borrowed freight wagon on the box beside the driver, and the mule was led at the tail on a lead line at a walk, because he had earned 3 days of standing still, and this was as close as she could give him to that. They came into the wash at the middle of the second afternoon. 4 men climbed down and stood a moment with their hats off. Delacroix walked the line of wagons slowly from the tail to the lead, and he did not speak. When he came to Barnaby Threlkeld under his canvas at the wheel of the first wagon, he squatted a long moment beside him and set his palm flat on the sun-warmed board of the wheel above the covered head, and he stayed that way until one of his men came up quietly and touched his elbow. They laid the 3 men on planks and lifted them into the wagon bed and covered them with a fresh tarp. They took the 6 wagons apart down to the axles and loaded the silver crates 2 by 2 into the freight wagon that had followed. They worked until the sun went off the rim, and they camped that night in the wash beside the covered dead and rose in the false dawn to finish the loading. And by the middle of the third afternoon they were rolling west again, with the whole strange harvest of the wash behind them. They came back into Requa Springs at dusk on the 5th day out. The silver crates were carried into the assay office one at a time, in the presence of Delacroix and 2 townsmen he had asked for as witnesses, and they were stacked along the back wall of Ashby's rear room floor to shoulder height, and Ashby locked the room's own inner door for the first time in the 11 years he had held its key. The 3 men were buried at mid-morning of the following day in the little rise north of town, under 3 fresh cedar markers cut by the town's carpenter without charge. And Reverend Alistair Boone stood at the head of each grave in turn and said the plain words, and Josephine stood at his elbow in her second dress, which she had washed the night before at Dorcas Vandermeer's sink. And she said the words her mother had said, and she meant them each of the 3 times, and she did not weep, because weeping was not what the 3 men had asked of her. By the end of the following week, the story of the wash had gone around Requa Springs in the small, careful way news travels in a town of 200 souls. It was known that the girl who had come in on the swayback mule had found what half the territory had been hunting for 4 months. It was known that she had brought in a wagon master's private savings for a child in Fort Cottonwood and had asked for only a finder's wage. What was not known, and what Ashby and Delacroix and Josephine kept unknown, by the small agreement of 3 people who had chosen each other on the basis of one afternoon sitting together, was the leather-bound book in the top shelf of the green iron safe, and the card that marked its page, and the road a man had ridden out of town 3 nights before along the north track towards Prescott, with an oilcloth packet in his saddlebag and no light showing. On the 9th morning after the burial, a stranger arrived in Requa Springs on the noon stage. He was a soft man in a black frock coat and polished boots of about 45, with the pale, unweathered face of a man who worked chiefly at a desk, and small round spectacles that pinched the bridge of his nose. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and a silver-headed cane in the other hand, though he did not appear to need the cane for walking. He took a room at the Vandermeer boarding house under the name Emmett Crowley of Santa Fe. He spent the afternoon walking the length of the single street, tipping his hat politely to any woman who passed him, entering the mercantile and the livery and the assay office in turn, buying nothing in any of them, asking small, mild questions in a voice that carried no threat and left no fingerprint. He asked after property records. He asked whether a young woman by the name of Ainsworth had recently taken up residence in the town. He asked whether the assay office had received any bullion in the last month that might be described as of unusual provenance. To each of these questions he received the small, careful answers a town gives a stranger who has not yet earned any other kind. Josephine saw him from the upstairs window above the feed store the first afternoon he was in town, and she did not need to be told who he was. He walked the way a man walks who has never in his life been made to walk against a wind. He had the black coat and the spectacles and the soft hands. He looked up once from the middle of the street as if he had felt her looking, and his eyes passed over the window without stopping, and he moved on, and she stepped back from the glass and stood a moment in the dim of the room and understood that the machine had sent its representative, and the representative had not come to arrest her, and had not come to threaten her, and had come only to see, with his own careful eyes, whether the small quiet fire he had been told about was really burning or was only smoke on a still afternoon. She went down at supper. Dorcas Vandermeer had seated the new guest at the far end of the long table, and Josephine took her own accustomed seat near the middle across from Wendell Kirkpatrick the smith, and did not look down the table at the stranger, and did not avoid looking either, and ate her plate of stew and biscuits with the same steady attention she gave any meal she had not cooked herself. Crowley spoke to her twice across the length of the table, once to remark mildly on the fineness of the biscuits. She agreed that Mrs. Vandermeer's biscuits were exceptional, once to inquire more mildly still whether she had traveled far to reach Requa Springs. She said she'd come in from the east some weeks back. He asked whether she meant to stay. She said she was helping in the assay office at present and had not yet formed a longer plan. He smiled a small closed smile that did not reach his spectacles and said that Requa Springs seemed a fortunate town to have gained her, and he returned to his plate. She understood exactly what he had done. He had put out a hand across the length of a supper table in a boarding house, in a town he had never been to before, and he had brushed her lightly once, to feel whether she flinched. She had not flinched. He had learned what he had come to learn, which was that the girl who had ridden in on the mule was not going to be moved by a soft man at a supper table with a silver-headed cane, and he would now, she believed, take the next stage south in the morning and report what he had seen to the men who had sent him, and the shape of what he reported would begin the shape of what came next. He took the morning stage south as she had expected. She watched from the upstairs window as he climbed into it in the pale early light, spectacles catching the sun as he lifted his face to nod to the driver, and she watched the stage roll out along the south road toward the flats, and she felt not exactly relief, but the small clean pause a person feels between one wave and the next when she is standing knee-deep in a rising sea, and knows that the next wave will come and can be met when it comes. The next wave came in the form of a rider on the fourth day after Crowley left. He came down the north track from Prescott at mid-afternoon on a hard-used bay, and he wore the badge of a United States Marshal under his coat, and he asked for Cornelius Ashby by name at the door of the assay office, and he went into the back room with Ashby and Josephine and Deputy Delacroix, and he stayed there for the better part of 2 hours. He was Marshal Whitfield Rennick, 48, gray at the temples, and he had ridden down from Prescott because a letter had reached him 7 days before through a private hand, and inside that letter had been the small leather-bound book with the 7 sets of initials on its front page. And by the end of the second hour in the back room, he had asked Josephine 3 separate times to tell him once more, in her own words, the shape of the morning at Halverson's Bend when Silas Merriweather had pressed the card into her hand. She told it 3 times. It came out the same 3 times. Rennick made his notes in a small square book of his own and closed it when they were done, and looked at her a long moment with the pale, tired eyes of a man who had spent a decade learning to tell truth from careful lies by the small motions at the corner of a witness's mouth. Miss Ainsworth, his voice was low and dry, I have been in this territory 11 years. I have known that certain men in the house at Prescott were engaged in the disposal of unlicensed bullion for the better part of 7 of those years, and I have not been able to bring one of them to a bar, because every witness I ever built a case around either recanted before the writ was served or was found by his own front door, on a morning I would rather not describe. What you have brought me by the road you brought it by is the first thing I have laid on my own desk in 7 years that cannot be recanted and cannot be reached, because the man who wrote it is beyond further pressure, and the girl who carried it is, if I have read her right this afternoon, not a woman who will be pressured either. He tapped his notebook against his thigh. I will not promise you a hanging. Emmett Crowley and the men he fronts for are lawyers, and lawyers know 100 small ways to make a case fall short of a rope. But I will promise you that within a year the mill that struck those bars will be shut, and the paper that Silas Merriweather used to take your uncle's house will be void in every court in this territory, and the man who wrote that paper for him will not draw a fee from a client in Santa Fe again. She thought about that a while. Then she said the thing that had been sitting on her tongue since Rennick had first come through the door. I do not want the house back, Marshal. I do not want to set foot in it again as long as I live. I only want the paper broken so that no other girl signs one like it on a table that used to be her mother's. Rennick looked at her a long, slow moment. Miss Ainsworth, that is the plainest speech I have heard from a witness in 11 years. It shall be done. The inquiry ran through the winter and into the spring. Silas Merriweather was not indicted because Silas Merriweather had been careful, and the machinery of the law in that territory in that year was not equal to a careful man in a black coat with a lawyer on retainer. But the deed to the plank house at Halverson's Bend was set aside by the district court at Prescott in February, on the grounds that the notary who had witnessed it had been shown, through the disciplined patience of Marshal Rennick and 2 clerks in Santa Fe, to have witnessed 23 other transfers of small holdings from young persons of no legal counsel to gentlemen of the same coat in the same year, and none of those 23 could stand the light of the inquiry either. The house was sold at auction in April, and the proceeds went into the Territorial Fund, and Silas Meriwether was not present at the sale. Emmett Crowley did not appear in a court on his own account, but the firm on the plaza in Santa Fe quietly dissolved in the summer, and its former partners took ship for California and New Orleans on separate dates, and the mill that had struck the private die was found in the fall by a small posse under Rennick's own command in a canyon south of Congress, and was broken up with sledges and its stones scattered. The 160 crates of silver from the wash were counted in public on the boardwalk, in front of Ashby's office on an afternoon that November, in the presence of the marshal and the deputy and 31 of the townspeople of Requa Springs, and the tally came to 3,200 bars, and grown men took off their hats without knowing exactly why. The bullion went, in due course, into the territorial vault at Prescott under a federal seal, and its final disposition was made by an act of the territorial legislature 2 years later, which distributed the proceeds to the widows and orphans of the mining districts, and no gentleman of the house rose to claim so much as a nail of it. Josephine took a room above the feed store for $2 a week, with a window that faced east toward the flats she had crossed. Dorcas Vandermeer, 62, gave her a place at the long table without ceremony, and set down in front of her that first evening the first hot supper she had eaten under a roof since Ezekiel, which was a plate of chicken and dumplings and a slice of dried apple pie the widow had baked in the afternoon on the strength of a hope she did not choose to name. Wendell Kirkpatrick, 49, took the mule into his corral on the second day and pulled all 4 shoes and reset them with new iron he would not accept payment for, saying only that the animal had carried her a long way and deserved better feet under him for the rest of what he had left. Reverend Alistair Boone, 54, walked her out to the little cemetery on the rise and pointed to a plot of unbroken ground for her uncle, whenever she should choose to move him from the caliche behind the plank house, and she thanked him and said she would think on it, and in the following spring a party of townsmen rode out to Halverson's Bend on her behalf, and brought Ezekiel Ainsworth home in a plain pine box, and laid him beside the 3 men from the wash under a 4th cedar marker that read only his name in the years, because Josephine had not been able to think of a better word for him than his own. Cornelius Ashby offered her a stool in the back of the assay office, and taught her to read the beam scale to a quarter grain, and to test a bar of silver with acid on the black stone, and within a month she was keeping the Threlkeld ledger in her own hand under his eye, and within 2 months she was signing receipts for small parcels on his authority, when he was called out to a mine or to Prescott on the business of the trust. She wrote a letter to Hattie Threlkeld at Fort Cottonwood in the 2nd week of November. It was a plain letter, and it said only that her uncle had loved her and had thought of her every day for 11 years, and that a milk cow and a stove and a place at the day school in Fort Cottonwood were being arranged, and that the arrangement was her uncle's and not any stranger's, and that she should know this now and always. Ashby carried the letter himself on the December stage along with the first $1,000 of the gold, and he stayed 3 days in Fort Cottonwood and returned with a short letter and an 8-year-old's careful printing that Josephine folded and put into the oilcloth beside Barnaby Threlkeld's own 4 pages and kept. By the end of her 3rd month in Requa Springs, people on the street called her by name when they passed her. Dorcas saved her the crust end of the cornbread. Wendell tipped his hat. Children who had heard the story pointed at her from doorways until their mothers told them to stop. On an evening in the 4th month, she climbed the outside stair to the room above the feed store and sat down on the edge of the cot with the window open to the east. The flats she had crossed lay out there under a lavender sky, and the dust of the day was settling, and the sound of Wendell's hammer had gone quiet an hour before. On the little pine table she had bought for $1.40, she set out 2 objects. She set out the brass compass with the chipped glass. She opened its case and let the needle settle north over the grain of the pine and watched it a moment and closed it again. She set the horn-handled pocket knife of Barnaby Threlkeld beside the compass, an inch of clear wood between them, and she left them there and she looked at them a long time. 2 things from 2 men who had never met each other and had never known the shape of the girl each of them had in his own way decided to leave a little something to. 2. Neither of them had said the word love in her hearing. Neither of them had ever needed to. Ezekiel had put the compass into her palm on a spring evening in her 15th year, and had said nothing at all in the giving of it, and Barnaby had written 4 pages in pencil against a wagon wheel on the 2nd night out of Fort Purgatory to a girl he could not name, and both acts had turned out to be, in the way of certain quiet acts by certain quiet men, the shape their love took because they did not have any other shape for it. She thought of Silas Merriweather counting 11 silver dollars onto her mother's oilcloth on a morning that had felt at the time like the end of the world. She could think of him now without heat. She could see him plainly. He had signed a paper for a plank house and a tobacco tin under a floorboard. He had believed, honestly, that these were the whole of what a girl at Halverson's Bend possessed. He had not known about the compass in her coat, or the 7 years of Ezekiel's teaching in her hands, or the steady script in her wrist, or the ability to read a track in the pale dust and a smell on the wind, or the small clean edge of a mistake she had made in the middle of a mineral afternoon and had learned from without being broken by. He had not, in the last accounting, been able to take any of those things, because none of them had ever been on the paper he had drawn up. He had missed entirely the one thing about her that was hers to find in a wash he did not know existed. There was no anger left in her toward him, only a small quiet accuracy which was more useful than anger. Downstairs, Dorcas called up the stair that supper was on the table, and Josephine answered that she was coming. She stood at the window one moment longer. 2 men were walking home from the livery. A dog was crossing the road at an angle in no particular hurry. In the window of the assay office, a lamp had been lit, because Cornelius Ashby was working late over the ledger of the Threlkeld Trust that she had ruled and headed in her own careful hand. She put the compass into the inner pocket of her coat where it had ridden for the better part of 200 miles of caliche and lava and salt pan, and she put the horn-handled knife into the pocket beside it, and she went down to eat. If this story stayed with you, if you sat down inside it, the way Josephine sat down at that pine table with 2 small objects laid out in front of her, take a moment now to subscribe and to share it with someone who has been turned out of a place and told they had nothing left. Those are the people who most need to hear how a girl with $11 and a brass compass crossed a set of flats and came down into a wash and became, in the space of one honest season, the person a whole town greeted by name on the street. And before you go, sit with this question a little while. What has someone tried to take from you that they could not in the end actually take? And what did you carry out of that room in your coat pocket that turned out to be worth more than everything they thought they had kept? Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and if you are willing what you carried out. We read everyone.